Faraday's Mirror, Book 1, Prologue, February 1996. Chief Aldrich leaned against his cruiser, setting his coffee down beside the strobing lights. He pushed up his cap and scratched at his coarse hair. Steam rose into the frigid air from his cup and from the wreckage of the Oaks place, especially where Mansfield stood in the shallow cellar hole, raking the ashes in search of human remains. 32 hours had passed since the catastrophic fire torched the house. Only a skeleton of charred beams now stood. The Plymouth Fire Department was long gone, and Charles and Felicity Oaks had been relocated to the Econo Lodge off Daniel Webster Highway, where they were, hopefully, getting some sleep and beginning to cope with the tragedy of losing their home and children. Aldrich refocused his gaze on the outstretched glove of Officer Partlow in front of him. It held a Ziploc bag full of blackened teeth from the mouth of a large canine. "So you found the remains of..." He glanced down at a yellow notepad on his clipboard, inked over with handwritten information about family and house. "The German Shepherd, but still no trace of the boys?" "Nothing, Chief," Partlow replied, giving a terse shake of his head. "Not a speck. No bones, no teeth, nothing. Don't think they're in there, tell you the truth." "Then where?" Partlow shrugged. "Search me." Aldrich nodded noncommittally. "Keep looking." "Well, Chief, you know we already been through this wreckage 3 times, the officer said, rubbing the bristly auburn ends of his mustache with nervous fingers. "Not lazy times, neither. We done the archaeology grid pattern you asked us to. We're being..." He thought for a moment. "Meticulous." The old man met his gaze with cold eyes until Partlow mumbled, "Yeah, we'll go through it again, just to be sure." He turned, picking his way back to the steaming rubble. He took up a thin-tined rake, stepped over the blackened concrete foundation, and gestured to his partner. Bud Aldrich had been on the Plymouth Police Force for nearly 40 years, and served as a chief for over a decade. He'd broken up a heroin ring, taken a bullet during a domestic dispute call, ticketed an acting governor for DUI, and yet this might be the most difficult case of his career. Aldrich liked answers, and he had none. He flipped through the glossy pictures under the pad on his clipboard. The 2-story clapboard house had caught and burned like kindling, faster than any 15-year-old home had a right to, what with federal fire safety regulations. The cause wasn't electrical or connected with the kitchen or furnace. It was chemical and centrally located, as if somebody had napalmed the place from the inside. Analysis of beam ash showed that the fire accelerant wasn't gasoline, kerosene, or butane. It had the chemist down at Concord stumped. Arson. The word stung in his mind. He'd called an arson investigator yesterday, talked it all through. The man and his accelerant detection canine would arrive within the hour. The chief prepared himself for a lecture on the ways in which his men had disturbed the crime scene while looking for the bodies. Aldrich glanced at his watch. He tossed his clipboard and bag of teeth onto the seat, picked up his coffee, and took a sip. His white brows furrowed. Who, he thought, starts a fire in an upstairs hallway? What could be the motive? Similar fires had been set by homeowners for insurance money, but the Oaks weren't in debt. They had no wealth to speak of, maybe $9,000 in the bank, and a bit more than that locked away in a retirement account, not enough for ransom. The family was well liked as far as that went, members of the local church and scout troop, charitable with their time and money. They homeschooled their kids, so there wasn't any high school drama or a love triangle. Racial terrorism? It was an election year. Political tension was high. Felicity Oaks was black and the boys were mixed, but this was New England, and a college town at that. It was an accepting place. To Aldrich's knowledge, they hadn't had a hate crime in 50 years. What about drugs? The Irish mob? He couldn't discount it. The family had come up from Boston. He stared at the ruined home, forcing himself to reconsider some of the ugly possibilities. Perhaps the boys set fire to mask their own flight. To where? Why? Could they have wanted their parents dead? He shook his head. There just wasn't enough data to make those kinds of grisly calculations, and as a small-town cop, he hated them. He closed the door of his cruiser, grunted, and set off around the yard again, his boots crunching. The heat from the flames had softened the ground, which refroze overnight. Crisply iced into the mud, footprints of firefighters crisscrossed ruts from the wheels of the engines. These were overlaid with the more recent tracks of his officers. It was all jumbled. But Aldrich could find no evidence that anyone had approached the house or left it. No prints went off into the woods beyond the ring of activity. A wider search had uncovered little. No discarded fuel containers or evidence of vehicles parked along the road. Neighbors had nothing suspicious to report. Rick Hubbard, diagonally across the street, had been tinkering with a snowmobile in his garage, its door wide open at the time of the fire. So where were the boys? Bud Aldrich cracked the knuckles in his right hand, popping them one after another. A squirrel scolded him from a hemlock tree. He scowled up, partially at the squirrel and partially at God. He had no answers, not even a lead, and unless the arson investigator turned up something he'd missed, he'd have to admit it to the parents soon.